As the temps start rising, I feel the familiar urge to refresh my closet, but I don't want to waste money on pieces I'll only wear once or for just one season. Thankfully, Quince changes that. Their clothes are timeless, lightweight, and far more elevated than anything else at this price. It finally feels like my wardrobe matches my standards. The best part is that Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices and premium fabrics and finishes, so you get to look good while feeling good. I'm pretty excited that I have upgraded my athleisure wardrobe for this summer. I bought a sweatshirt and a pair of wide-leg flow pants that are two of the softest items I own, and I plan to live in them. So join me in giving your summer closet an upgrade with Quince. Go to quince.com/POTC for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/POTC to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/POTC.
The other very interesting thing about delusions is that they're always encoded. They have a kind of encoded meaning. They feel like communiques. They're sort of smuggling in hopes and fears, and they're quite performative in that sense. They're asking for an audience, whether that's from somebody, a loved one, or from the wider public. They're asking for interpretation.
That was Victoria Sheperd on Psychologist Off the Clock. We are three clinical psychologists here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas from psychology to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, and co-author of Act Daily Journal.
I'm Dr. Yael Schoenbrunn, a Boston-based clinical psychologist, assistant professor at Brown University, and author of the upcoming book, Work, Parent, Thrive.
And from sunny San Diego, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty and the Big Book of Act Metaphors.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock.
Psychologists Off the Clock is proud to be partnered with Praxis Continuing Education. Praxis is the premier provider of evidence-based training for mental health professionals.
And here at Psychologists Off the Clock, we are huge fans of Praxis. One of the things I love most about Praxis is they offer both live and on-demand courses. So if you're really looking for that live interaction with other people who are taking the course, you can get that. Or if you have a busy schedule and you need something that you can just kind of click onto whenever you have time, they offer that as well. And every course I have ever taken from Praxis has really been of such value to me.
I get questions a lot from clinicians who are looking for ACT training or other types of trainings, and Praxis is my go-to place that I send people no matter what level they are, because they have really good beginner trainings for people who have no experience. And they also have terrific advanced trainings on different topics and just people who want to keep building their skills.
You can go to our website and get a coupon for the live trainings by going to our offers page at offtheclockpsych.com/sponsors, and we'll hope to see you there. I'm here with Jill to introduce an episode on Rethinking Delusions. I had the opportunity to talk with an author, Victoria Sheperd, who had written a book called A History of Delusions, and it has a great subtitle, The Glass King, A Substitute Husband and a Walking Corpse. And what I wanted to kind of share is that after I finished the recording with Victoria, we just started talking about how history and mental health are often so siloed, right? That we talk about history like in a totally different world than we would ever talk about mental health. And she's sort of bringing together these two topics and in a really helpful way, because it helps us to understand what is the history of how we've understood this presentation and how can history help us understand it better. And this was also something that I discussed with Carl Eric Fisher in the episode on the history of addiction. That was episode 235. So I think I've gotten really interested in sort of how history of mental health plays into some of the mistakes that we currently make and how we can use history to better our understanding of the different kinds of things that we see in the field of mental health. And one thing that is really striking about this conversation is that delusions are much more common than we might think, right? That we think of it as sort of this very extreme event that happens for people who are really sick. And actually, most of us can probably identify some form of delusional thinking. And delusions are defined as a fixed false belief. So Jill, I'm curious what you think about that.
Well, I think first of all, I found this episode absolutely fascinating. And that piece you just mentioned is what really, really struck me. That, admittedly, I've always thought about delusions as something that floridly psychotic people experience. And Victoria really reconceptualizes this as something that all of us may have a tendency to experience when we get hooked by a narrative in a really rigid fashion. And one of the things I was thinking about personally is I have a brother. I typically refer to him as my bad brother and my other brother as my good brother. This very narrow conceptualization, these unidimensional characters that they are. And my quote unquote bad brother is currently incarcerated. And, I have a narrative about him being a bad person and a monster, and that's that. But interestingly, my other brother and my father have a very different idea about him, different from me, but also different from each other. So all three of us have different stories about our beliefs about this person. And all of our beliefs are pretty fixed, pretty rigid, and we all think we're right. But how can we all be right and have three different stories? And it just really got me thinking like, I guess in some ways this is kind of a form of delusion. And what you talk about a lot is the function of that typically these delusions, even the ones that are, I think I'm Napoleon or I'm made of glass, or the ones that seem more bizarre, that you can trace all of them to some sort of function. And of course, for me, this is how I feel safe and secure in the world, to create a story about this person being bad and being dangerous and therefore deciding to be estranged and have no contact. And, it just really got me thinking like, do I need to rethink this fixed belief? Is there some cost here? And I don't have an answer to the question yet, but it just got me thinking about this in an entirely new way. And you even, a little bit into the episode, you even challenge listeners to do the same. And I found it fascinating.
Well, I love that conducting these interviews and listening to one another's interviews, Jill, has such an impact on our own lives. And it's something that you and Debbie and I talk about regularly, that, the lessons that we learn through the guests that we have and the books that we read really can change the trajectory of how we live our daily lives. And I love that you're sort of absorbing some of these messages and kind of questioning your own stories about your brother. And so I do hope that listeners stay tuned all the way to the end for various ideas on how to relate to delusions in others and delusions in ourselves. And Jill, I'm curious to hear where more reflection on your story about your brother, where it lands you. So we hope you enjoy this episode. I'm here with Victoria Sheperd, who has produced scores of documentaries for BBC, including the 10-part series with the title A History of Delusions. And today she's here to talk with us about her new book, A History of Delusions, with a terrifically intriguing subtitle, The Glass King, A Substitute Husband and a Walking Corpse. Welcome, Victoria.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. I'm so excited to talk about delusions and the history of delusions because the importance of context in mental health has become increasingly recognized. But what most people, even those of us in mental health professions, don't often recognize is that even our understanding of delusions should be understood within context. And that's where your new book really offers a huge eye-opening opportunity.
Yeah, I'll start, I'm a social historian. And I think that the way I became a kind of a detective of delusions historically, which is how I see myself. I was researching something completely different for another history of science. It was the history of the heart. And I came across, so this is the first part of the subtitle, I came across a reference which jumped off the page to me, which was a reference to King Charles VI of France, who's a 14th, 15th century king, who this little subtitle, this little doodle in the margins of whatever I was reading jumped out saying that he had thought that he had turned into glass. And I immediately stopped what I was doing. I did finish that series, but a bit slower. And I thought, what's this? A medieval king who thought he turned into glass. And I started digging into that. He was publicly dealing with the 100 Years' War with England. So he had a full-time, full job on there. But in his private life, he was completely consumed with anxiety that he would smash if he came into contact with any hard objects. And he was reported, there are chronicles by Pope Pius II about his life, and he was reported to have wrapped himself in blankets to stop himself from smashing. And whilst it's a kind of absurd scenario, it's ridiculous, there was something else in it that was the life and death. Here's this king. The courts of Europe were laughing at him because of his belief that he turned into glass. So it got me thinking about the jeopardy of that. What was his delusion, his delusional belief, his fixed false idea, which is the definition I use of delusions, his single fixed false idea about himself. What was that doing for him? Because it must have been doing something pretty important to risk ridicule across Europe. And it's no less than life and death to him. He clung to it. And that seems to be true across many different delusions, across centuries. People cling to them. They are serving some kind of protective function, I argue in the book. And it does stand up. So as I kind of extended my research into other delusions across other centuries, people started sort of speaking to each other, these individuals, and there seemed to be functions in delusions and what they were offering people in terms of protection and help with their difficult realities that were repeating again and again. So helping you to reconcile irreconcilable conflict that came up again and again. Simply an alternative reality that helps you deal with a really, really wretched reality, and so on and so on. So it all started with this glass king. And of course, glass, talking about the social context, another thing that keeps cropping up is technology, new technology of the day. And again, delusions seem to peg themselves to new technology. And at the time, glass was a relatively new substance. It came from heating sand until it became transparent. And so it's kind of alchemical, extraordinary material that's transparent but also breakable. And so you can start to understand what seems completely absurd starts to make some kind of sense. It's a kind of distance regulator, potentially. It's a kind of way of telling the world how to treat you, saying, look, I'm stay away, stay back, sort of social anxiety expression, stay away, but also I'm precious, I'm kind of magical, I'm a treasure. Yeah. So, there's lots in it that is both of its time with each of these 10 characters that I talk about in the book, but also again and again, the patterns and the functionality echoes all over the place. And so I do think the context is potentially helpful.
Yeah, and I think you're pointing something out that most of us don't really, again, even in the field of mental health, don't think too much about, which is the functionality of beliefs. And so I do a lot of couples therapy, and this often happens where, one person really has a strong belief and the other person really can't understand why. And if we sort of get curious about the functionality of that belief, we get much further in connecting and understanding and joining one another than we do by trying to just disprove it. And you make this point in your book, which I think is such an important one, that our tendency, our impulse is to want to prove somebody's fixed belief that has evidence contradicting it wrong. And you say that that's kind of the wrong way to go about it. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that, because you make this point again and again in your book that we can learn about people, about time and place, but also the individual themselves by really listening deeply to the delusion.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it's certainly given me a lot more compassion for other people. Because, as you say, the one thing that's true about delusions is that logic will not, we know about this from conspiracy theory, right? Which is, very current. Logic isn't going to touch the sides with it. Logic's never going to get anywhere. Why is that? Well, what again, there's the functionality of it. If it seems to be that there's often a kind of scaffolding that it's offering people, a protective scaffolding, this belief, and that's why people will cling to it. And the reason for that, I mean, the other very interesting thing about delusions is that they're always encoded. They have a kind of encoded meaning. They feel like communiques. They're sort of smuggling in hopes and fears, and they're quite performative in that sense. They're asking for an audience, whether that's from somebody, you know, a loved one, or from the wider public. They're asking for interpretation, and I think that that's what sort of really started to give me a real sense of compassion for what we're all trying to do when we navigate difficulties in our lives. We all really want to be worthy of that, don't we? To be worthy of interpretation, to be worthy of kind attention. And we don't get much of it, most of us. And some of us get absolutely none of it. Certainly some of the characters from past women in the past, I think, probably had even less than most of the men in the past. And so there's this sense in which you're engaging. When a delusion is presented to a person, I'm made of glass, or I'm Napoleon, or whatever it is, or my husband's been murdered and swapped for a double, or whatever it is, there's a kind of thriller quality to it. There's an inherent mystery that's asking for the audience to that belief. Of course, this is all unconscious. I'm not suggesting in any way that people are doing this cynically or consciously, but that's asking for interpretation. And I think that's the key to it, that if you look at it like that, and perhaps we could apply that to ourselves. If you look at a partner or a loved one or colleagues fixed false belief, rather than arguing with them, you might consider just sitting with them, going a few steps towards them. I mean, some of the physicians from the past kind of understood this, even if they didn't write it down in these terms, that the only way, really, ruses didn't tend to work. The only thing that tended to allow somebody to release a fixed false idea was if somebody stepped maybe a part ways towards it, played the game, as it were, a little bit, met them halfway, and then it allowed people to kind of potentially let go. The only kind of indication I had that people did step away from their delusions, or sort of put them down a bit, was by somebody, engaging with it, you know, offering to listen very simply, to give it attention, and to interpret, to decode it, and to try and find out what the hopes and fears and what seems completely crazy might be. And I think you can, apply that to now, and to relationships, as, you know, live relationships that we're all engaged in.
Yeah, and maybe even on a broader spectrum. And I want to step into this idea of broader conspiracy theories in just a second. But I think what you're offering is a really actionable tip, that when somebody close to you, or just an acquaintance even, shares a belief that seems ludicrous to you, rather than getting into a debate about whether there's logic behind it or not, to get really curious and join them and really engage around the functionality. Like, what is that belief telling you about them? How is it helping them? How is it helping them make sense of the world? How can you understand them better? And approaching it from that perspective actually loosens the grip and lands you in a more collaborative position and a less sort of stuck position. And I think that is just such a useful tip. And I will point out that I think that is one of the major superpowers of therapy, right? That most of the kinds of therapies that you find on the market, that is the general thrust, is that the therapist is there to listen and to understand the function of what's going on with the patient, the client, to join them, to understand, you know, why it is that they believe what they do, not to fight with them. And there is something incredibly healing about that, you know, from depression, where you sort of have these overly negative beliefs, to a straight, you know, delusional belief, that joining with somebody and being curious and sort of empathically being with them is much more powerful than arguing with them or trying to prove them wrong.
I really have come to believe that. If you pardon the pun, I have.
Hopefully it's not delusional.
I know. It all gets very meta if you're not careful with this. I was very pleased to go to my first book event, you know, to make sure it was all real, it was all true. I hadn't dreamt the whole the whole book story. I mean, a really key. I started making a series for BBC Radio, which the book became a kind of, you know, a history version of it. And one of the key pieces of research, which keeps you humble in this topic, came out of Baltimore in 1991, which was the first time that they'd ever asked the general population about delusional thinking. There just never are. So the only people who'd ever been categorized or diagnosed were people with very, very extreme beliefs. People, who thought they were Napoleon, or who thought King George the Third had stolen the throne from them. But when they asked the general population, a random sample in 1991, they found, what I suppose we all know, if we're really honest with ourselves, they found that we're all delusional. We all have at least one fixed false idea about ourselves that if we asked our loved ones, they'd say that's not true.
Yeah. It kind of brings to mind beliefs like imposterism, like I'm not good enough, that everybody around you, might say, what are you talking about? You've achieved this and that and the other thing, or nobody loves me when you're in close relationships. That there's these sort of common beliefs that many of us get trapped in and nobody else buys them, but we hold them lightly enough and they're not interfering too much with our day-to-day lives, so they don't sort of count. But what you're saying is, and the study shows, is that, most of us have something like that, like a belief that really doesn't go along with how other people see the world or see us.
I think we all do. It took me a long time for the penny to drop about what mine was, but
what are yours?
Mine is a phobia, which is interesting because phobias operate very similar. They are delusions in a sense. So I had a long-standing phobia of going in lifts. Elevators to in the US,
to the American.
So again, it's a kind of the similarity there is that I suppose it gives you knowing that we all have skin in the game, right? That's the point. We can't look at it as a kind of cabinet of curiosities as we go through these 10 stories that I have in the book. They are kind of stranger than fiction. They all have a kind of thriller, mystery element to them, and they're extreme. But when you know that you're on that scale, you have a humility, and we all, that we all have to sort of accept, and that these are just stories with the kind of contrast turned up. They're like technicolor versions of things that we all have. And when you start to realize that, it's unnerving, but it also gives you so much. It's very comforting because you can look at somebody, I mean, Robert Burton from the 1500s, or these people from hundreds of years ago, and there's a real sense of kind of hand-holding and of seeing how ingenious people are imaginatively and creating these alternative realities they may not be healthy in the long run, but they're certainly psychological survival strategies in the short term, and they're kind of ingenious. And so I've sort of, after spending so much time, a lot of it in lockdown, with these 10 characters, I'm really, I'm really kind of humbled and impressed by the ingenuity of their imagination, and therefore in all of us, that we can find these strange ways of, as I say, sometimes it's not healthy.
What you're saying right now is that delusions sometimes help people out with their complicated, wretched realities. But what's notable is that for many of the stories that you describe in your book, and certainly this is true in modern life, delusions can really cause a lot of problems. It landed folks into insane asylums where they were locked down for life and made them the laughingstock of, their kingdom. And so in what ways do you understand that delusions really help people who are in dire straits in some way or another?
Well, I came to see it very crudely in 3 very clear functionalities that have continued to repeat. So the kind of the primer, the simplest mechanic example of that is the spate of people who thought that they were Napoleon, the Emperor Napoleon, in the 1800s in France, and there were, literally tens of them. And this is the ones that were recorded. And this is after he died, who turned up at the big asylums in France saying that they were Napoleon. France had been through, a catastrophic political and social century, if not more. And it's pretty clear what that delusion's doing. It's giving people of low status, people with no feeling of agency about their life, or of desperate, feelings of impotence. There they are. They take on the costume of the most sort of powerful at the time icon of kind of self-made power and autonomy. So that's the sort of simplest way in which it's clear that it was serving a protective function. It was just giving yourself, rather brilliantly and rather simply, power that you didn't have in the common sense reality that everybody else accepts. The other very clear one is allowing what it shows, the second sort of category, which is helping you to deal with irreconcilable conflict. It seems as though, and I'm sure you must come to this every day, but that we all seem to find it incredibly difficult to live with conflicting feelings, nebulous threats, but particularly conflicting feelings. And so I have a character in my book called James Tilly Matthews, who was a tea broker in 18th century London, who taught himself, he kind of got in with an intellectual circle who sort of adopted him. And he ended up on a boat going to revolutionary France with Priestley, all these public figures. And suddenly there he was, a kind of self-styled diplomat, just as the revolution was kicking off. And he was trying to work with this deputation to stop the revolution. Of course, quickly became, got himself into the hottest water you can imagine, where the English thought he was a spy. The French thought he was a spy. Everybody had a reason to kill him. It's amazing that he didn't wasn't killed under the guillotine, and he was kicked back to England, where he lived in poverty with his wife and child in Camberwell, which maybe your US listeners may not know, but it's quite gentrified now. But at the time, it was a very poor area of South London, and so that kind of reversal of fortune, as well as the kind of conflicted political scene that was very, where who was in the right and who was in the wrong would flip on a sixpence. And out of this was born his extraordinary delusional belief that there was a gang, a kind of proto-Dickensian gang on the streets of London who were using a contraption called an heirloom, what he called an heirloom, and it was using magnetic forces to influence the government to bring revolution. So the magnetic rays would go from the heirloom into Parliament and give them revolutionary ideas. And he goes into the Houses of Parliament at Westminster and starts screaming at Lord Liverpool and his government. And he's hauled out and arrested and put into an asylum. So again, you have the technology, you have lots of physical forces were being discovered. So again, like with glass, you have kind of the new understanding of invisible forces or new technologies emerging, and his delusion is kind of pegged onto that. But anyways, it's a conspiracy theory. He was called the first paranoid schizophrenic, and it's a paranoid conspiracy. But you can see what it's doing. He's creating this very simple plot whereby this gang of villains are trying to overturn the British government, and they need to be stopped, and everybody needs to get on board. And he turns what's an incredible soup of conflicting and messy politics and humiliation, and it's the murkiest thing you can possibly imagine. He turns it into a very, very simple conspiracy theory with the good and the bad. And so again, it's this simplification, a dangerous simplification when you can be, right, with conspiracy theory, but you can see what it's doing for him.
Right. I think this comes up so often in close relationships where, for example, if you have new parents and they're both exhausted and stressed out and overwhelmed with all of the stressors that are new and confusing and chaotic, and one of the things that's very easy for the mind to do is to just assign all the villainy to the partner. Well, I'd feel so much better if my partner was helping more. And of course, that might be an important part of the complicated story, but it's just one part. And yet the mind goes there almost exclusively in a lot of cases. And it's an interesting, I think, more subtle take on what it is that you're describing, which is, in a time of chaos and pain and overwhelm, our mind wants a simple story and explanation. And so delusions are sort of that taken to a very extreme level.
I think that's fascinating. I think that's absolutely beautiful and true, because that conflict, you can apply it to a very, it's a seismic moment. Having a baby, it may not be revolutionary France, but it's, it feels like it, doesn't it?
It really does. It really does.
So I think, cognitive dissonance and all of those things, how we kind of become more aware in our own lives, what history can kind of show us about I don't know if it's being able to accommodate ambiguity, ambivalence. It's a bit you, it's a bit me. It's hard to say. How can we kind of train ourselves and our society to be able to hold conflicting things and accept that it's not simple? I think James Tilly Matthews is a kind of daring do. It's a sort of incredible story, but it is a kind of lesson about that, about the dangers, and the dangers of it's protective. You can see how ingenious his mind was, and he wasn't kind of raving mad in inverted commas at all. He was, in fact, quite the opposite. But he never ever let go of this belief in the conspiracy theory. But he spent his whole time in the Bedlam Hospital. I don't know, is Bedlam a term in the US?
Yeah,
just
chaos.
For chaos, right?
Yeah.
So that's where that comes from. The Bethlehem, the Bedlam Hospital, which was this very chaotic asylum in South London, where he spent the next sort of 40 years of his life.
Wow.
So you can see, but he was sort of the father there. People came to him, and he was a brilliant draftsman. He drew his conspiracies, and with these characters and this other world. You can look at them. Anyone can look at them online. Actually, the Wellcome Collection, 2 L's, which is a great big kind of medical repository of medical writing and drawings. Anyway, they're all online. They're worth a look, because you can really travel into his mind, see what he was seeing. He draws the heirloom and so on. But you can see that he'd simplified the threat. He'd organized his enemy. That's how I think that's the key phrase that you can apply to yourself as a warning. Is this neater than it is accurate? Am I just organizing my enemy here?
I love that. I love that as a tip to sort of, check your own story. Like when it gets too simple,
right,
in a complicated situation, it's an important time to maybe zoom out and look for the more nuanced version of the story. And so what's the third kind? So there's sort of the first way that delusions can be helpful is to help us feel more important when we've been made invisible and sort of been confronting major injustice and have no way to sort of stand up for ourselves. That delusions can help give us a sense of greater importance in the world, that they can organize chaos in this way that helps us manage overwhelm and uncertainty. And then what's the third way?
So that again comes back to the king, the when it's a metaphor, so you sort of melt into the object. So becoming glass again. Glass is still, I I have had a few people contact me, a producer who said, actually, it's funny, I thought my legs had turned to glass at one point, even though, of course, glass isn't new. It still has, and again, we go back to the kind of ambivalence. It has amazing qualities. I can't think of any other material that has them, that is both fragile but brittle, beautiful but breakable, and it can embody and hold contradictory qualities. And so it's still, even hundreds of years later, something that speaks to us. It certainly spoke to me. It made the hair on the back of my neck. That's what got me into the whole sort of topic in the first place, because I just knew, I could just feel from fairy tale slippers, the glass slippers, and it still has a charge to it. So they overlap, I think what glass, but you essentially that you become something. Your delusion is a bodily one, that you have become, a wolf, or you've become something. It's a somatic idea.
And it's almost like offering a metaphor to explain to the world what's going on internally at an emotional or sort of more gut level, that it's a way to communicate. And
that one, the kind of social anxiety that I feel, it's even more potent as a disorder, if you like, now, because it's with population, we all live in smaller and smaller spaces, and the idea of it being a distance regulator, a delusion like that. And I think that would not just be glass, but glass is a very kind of easy way into that. You can sort of, it's telling people to, as I said, to sort of stay back, but also asking for admiration to an extent, asking to be to be treated well and to be seen as precious.
Yeah.
And I mean, the other thing that came out of it, it's part of the first element, the kind of dealing with just a really wretched existence. I came across again and again how powerful humiliation, a reversal of fortune, people who humiliated, delusions come out of humiliation again and again and again. I'd say probably that word would be at the back of more than any other as a kind of trigger for a delusion. And it's really set me thinking about just how strong that is when it happens to you, that being humiliated. I mean, I'm sure there's kind of evolutionary reasons for that in terms of being part of society and so on. Although it's interesting because delusions do challenge that, because you would think that nobody wants to be embarrassed. Nobody wants to go against, we have this drive to kind of not go against the crowd, not be humiliated. And yet a delusion often comes out of humiliation, but it involves making these kind of public declarations that go against the public,
And maybe the function of that is to regain some agency, because often the initial humiliation is done without our consent, without our control, without any influence from us. But the delusion is maybe, in a sense, a way to regain some of that agency, even if the humiliation is sustained. At least you have more control over it. And there's something, I think, very inherently human about that desire to have some agency over how things go.
That's really interesting that you're kind of replaying it, but with you in charge of it. So you're kind of rerunning the humiliation. Yeah, I hadn't thought of it like that, but I think that's right. Because they seem to be at odds. It seems to go against this drive that everyone talks about to stay with the common sense reality. It's enormously brave, reckless, hard to understand why you would break that, why you'd put your head above the parapet.
Yeah.
And that I think there's a lot in that powerlessness again is a really toxic sensation. We don't want to feel anything rather than feel humiliated or powerless, right?
Yeah. But it does get to this question. I mean, the whole conversation about delusions as a fixed false belief supposes that somebody is right and somebody is wrong about whether a belief is false. And so there's this question, and I think it's inherent throughout your book, and various points you make it explicit, but like, who gets to decide what is a delusion versus what is not? And I think that really does get to some controversy that is very timely, which is for example, I don't know if you've heard of the term mass formation. And if listeners haven't heard of it, it's defined as when mob influence leaves an individual with disturbed thoughts and perception and unable to fully distinguish what's real from what's not. And this idea of even the existence of mass formation is pretty controversial. There have been some prominent voices that have been in the news lately with regard to COVID and folks believing that the pandemic is more of a psychosis that's the result of this mass formation than it is a reality. And I don't necessarily want to get into that per se, but I do think it gets to this underlying question of who gets to decide whether a belief is false or not. And you can look back in history, for example, when are you considered a prophet versus a mad person? So this comes up in religion all the time.
I think certainly in terms of, I have one character in my book, Francis Spira, who was caught up in the Counter-Reformation in Italy, Italian lawyer. You can look at his delusion. His delusion was that he was damned for all eternity, that God had kind of come to him and told him that he was damned to hellfire. And he reported to have starved himself to death, to kind of negated himself and just refused food because his belief that he was damned. And you very quickly get to with what you can't help but see that with one person's religious belief is another person's delusion.
Right.
and it's that one's been fought out. The Reformation, the Counter-Reformation was people burning on pyres all over Europe, is an extremely violent dramatization of that, but it's still true, isn't it? And it's the one area that you know, we can't, you can't say with any clarity that, well, some people would say that all religion is delusional, right?
But that might be like a mob belief. Some people might say that, but we're not medicating.
Theirs.
We're not medicating those delusions.
No, we're not.
We're allowing them to be and supporting them.
Right. And so, that's not even close to have been, we haven't unpicked, and maybe we shouldn't. I mean, that's the other element, the should it be cured question mark that runs through all these stories all the way back to ancient Greece, and I think, like I mentioned, ruses, this idea that you can kind of trick people, that physicians would sort of say, oh, you think you've already died. I have another French woman who thought she'd already died. It's important to say that a lot of these case studies come from France just after the revolution, because that's when delusions as a kind of discrete subject were being categorized and researched for the first time. There were these new great big asylums that grew up in Paris. And that's when they were really, trying to create a taxonomy of delusions. And they wrote down, they listened to these men and women, and they made copious notes, people like Capgras, and they created, there's still kind of principal delusion types, like delusions of doubles, erotomania, the delusion that somebody of higher status is in love with you.
That's my favorite one.
Right. I mean, that's Madame. They all have these pseudonyms because, of course, they're poster girls, usually poster girls, sometimes poster boys for these doctors' papers which announce these delusion types to the world. And so they suddenly become Madame X or Madame M, who thought her husband had been spot for a double. And you kind of, my job has been to try and find the real story, what traumas or events had happened to them behind these kind of pseudonyms. And, you find their real name, and it's quite exciting. Louise, Madame M was really called Louise. But yes, the erotomania is a particularly dangerous and kind of timely, or rather kind of this sort of modern era disorder, because it's like stalking. It manifests like stalking. So Leia Anne Obey, who's the character, she's in the 1920s, but she becomes convinced from Paris that George V of England is in love with her, and she travels. I found out that she'd actually been dumped by her lover, so she'd really seriously experienced some humiliation. And her delusion springs up that he's in love with her. So it's an interesting one, because it says it kind of denies all responsibility for your behaviour. It's George V. He's the one who's in love with me. I'm not stalking him. But of course, she goes to Buckingham Palace and stands outside and looks, waiting for the curtains to twitch to give her a message to say, "Come and meet me," at Victoria Station. So it's kind of, you can see what the mind is doing, because it's disowning agency and responsibility, and also, but it's also, creating love for yourself. It's making you the heroine of your story, but of course it's potentially extremely dangerous, because it won't take any responsibility for your actions. And so many of these delusion stories are kind of compelling and fascinating, but they have to be taken very seriously. I'm very aware, and I hope that I have treated them all. They're not kind of whimsical, weird, curio stories. There's, at the heart of them, they're understandable. I have come to believe that they're all understandable from a psychological level, but some of them are real. There's real warning, and there's real menace as well. That they can be a danger to the person and to others. So I take them seriously as much as I'm fascinated by them.
Well, and I think you really do. I think more than we have in history, take them seriously, because you're so curious about the function and sort of the cause, and sort of how they're serving the person. And you're really understanding it in context, which I think is so important. And I think, just to get back to this question of like, who gets to decide what's a delusion and what's not, I think you throw some question into that, which is, that what looks like a straight delusion and, kind of crazy at the on the superficial level can really be understood in context as making a lot of sense. And so, again, I think this is a cue to us in the mental health field and just in the world at large, that when somebody says something that feels or seems crazy, to just, engage that curiosity. And I think that can be a very actionable thing that we can do that is very healing and more positive in the world. I also wanted to kind of follow up with this question of the neurological causes of delusions, because the way that we're talking about it, it seems very psychologically driven. But you write, and I'll quote from your book, that delusions sit at the intersection between neurology and psychology, and different causes frequently coexist within the same individual, overlap and fuse. And so I think an important point that you make in the book is not that delusions are simply a manifestation of something that helps us in a chaotic, difficult time in our lives, but also that it can coexist with biological causes. And because you're drawing from, way back in history, we often don't have any strong evidence for the biological causes, but certainly we know today that when brain scans are done of folks with, major psychosis, that we often can see some brain damage. And yet that doesn't negate the fact that those false beliefs can make sense if we listen deeply.
Yeah, and it's a real challenge as a historian, but I've turned it. I've come to see it as probably the most interesting grit in the book, and the most potentially kind of the thing I can learn from most, or we can all learn from most, which I think is best exemplified in Madame M. So she's a woman in 1920s France. Well, actually, it was during the First World War. She becomes a case study in the 20s, but during the First World War, she turns up at a police station saying that her husband's been murdered in exchange for a double. So she develops a delusion of doubles, that her husband's been substituted and her children have been substituted and abducted and substituted. And it's an extremely it's like an Edgar Allan Poe short story of kind of people being, having their identity stolen, kind of Frankenstein-like, and being operated on to change their identity and so on. So it's a very clear kind of psychological. I interpret, I put a psychodynamic lens on it, very kind of hands up. I do that throughout the book. And you can see perfectly well why it turns out her children have, she's unhappily married, probably. The inference is she's very unhappily married. Her children have died in infancy. She's had several children die in infancy, as well as the First World War. So you can start to understand on a psychological level very clearly why it would be easier to deal with the idea that they're not dead, that they've been substituted, or that not that you really don't like your husband. It's that he's not your husband. He's been substituted, right? The psychodynamic lens makes sense, and I think it stands up. But then, you learn that dementia with Lewy bodies, or it's the clearest, delusion of doubles has the kind of clearest relationship to front cortex neurological brain damage of any of the delusions that I found. And, I know somebody, a friend of the family, who had this particular form of dementia, and essentially it disrupts the recognition part of your brain. And somebody is familiar, but you don't know who they are, and your left brain, I believe anyway, not neurologist, but steps in with the kind of explicable narration that says, oh, well, they've been swapped, they've been substituted, they're a double. And you can see, as you say, you can see that on brain scans. So how do I have to then sit with these two truths. And so I do believe, we'll never know whether Madame M also had some kind of right front recognition center of her brain damage. We can't know. So it will always be mysterious was there any brain damage? Or was it all psychological, or is it both? And there's something for me, there's a kind of ambivalence or ambiguity that I have to sit with. But I think that's right. I think it should be uncomfortable. We can't know. These people are mysterious. We can find little fragments. We can start to get insights into understanding what their reality was like, and therefore why they created an alternative one. But we can't solve it. We can't call it one way or the other. And so in a way, it's a good regulator for me to know that the neurology and the psychology are kind of dancing with each other. And it's mysterious, right? We won't solve it.
I think we often can't solve it. The brain is so mysterious, even with modern technology. There's still so many things that we don't understand. But what I'll say is, and this is just a hypothesis, but I do think that neurology plays a huge part for many people who have brain disorders or traumas in, perceptions that are not linked up with reality. Where I think it turns into delusion is the story that we make about it. It's sort of like if you have a visual hallucination because you haven't slept for days and days, that can happen. But I wouldn't call that a delusion. But when it becomes a more fixed story that we hold on to, then it becomes a delusion. And then I think there's something often to interpret there about why that story is helping to either make sense of the world, to re-empower you, to help you feel some sense of coherence in a chaotic world. And so I think, again, that neurology plays a huge important role in delusions, and that we can sort of help people more if we look for the story that the brain then makes from a perception and understand how it's serving an individual. And again, there's sort of like such a range of severity of this, but I think, my new couple example is, at one end, and then somebody who feels that they're being persecuted in this way that doesn't, fit with the reality that the rest of the people around them see is sort of like a different level entirely. But in both cases, the story that gets made by the brain based on, a perception that's had in a difficult time it's helpful to sort of disentangle that and understand the function that it's serving.
Yeah, and absolutely. And I think it's interesting because I've tried to trace very broadly, how they've been seen, over the centuries. So delusions were seen as an imbalance of humours, part of melancholy, which kind of what we'd call depression, sort of. Then it became demonic possession, pretty much. That was it for hundreds of years. And then it became, correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels as though it did swing very far into saying it was organic brain. The explanation would be in, brain damage, malformation of the brain, so on and so forth. And I feel swinging a bit back, to say that we've thrown a lot of the psychological stuff away, and we need to redress the balance.
I totally agree. And what I'll add in there is, like, for example, I've had a couple of patients with bipolar disorder, and when there's a manic episode and there's manic style delusions, those individuals can really be dismissed for what they're feeling or thinking or believing in ways that are entirely unhelpful, because there is a kernel of truth. It just has gotten blown up a bit. But by invalidating what that kernel of truth is really painful for the person, gets them more entrenched because they're defending it more strongly, and really disconnects them from the people who love them and are concerned about them. And so I think dropping into that really strong belief that all delusions are simply organic manifestations of something that's gone wrong in the brain can, just from a very functional perspective, be really unhelpful. And really understanding and sort of bringing in, like, yes, there is a brain piece that is important here that we need to integrate, but there's also something more. There's the psychological piece, the functionality piece that's really important, and to be curious about that and not to kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater, and to really sort of embrace it, like, from a compassionate stance, is really helpful.
Yeah, and to enter into the game of it. I don't mean a game to trivialize it, but it does strike me that as it people want. It's interesting to look at it in terms of children. We'll get down on our knees and play with a 5-year-old child. My 5-year-old child. They engage in delusions all the time, don't they? acting out an alternative reality. And we know that that's good and expanding of, we know that we'll get to some truths, or we know that that's an important thing for children to do, to play with reality. And yet we somehow go, oh no, you're over 18. You do that stops, or you're not mature, you're not, and maybe there's something in that. So that, engaging with what people are trying to tell you in code, in a kind of play code, they are sneaking. They're trying to tell you things that you need to interpret, and you will, if you go halfway or you play that game a little bit, you will allow them to be less vigilant, or less, as you say, less strident, and there will be much more to understand than you could ever believe. I mean, it surprised me. I didn't know, as I was researching, but in every single case, they were understandable, as you say, to a degree. And in every single case, they had a very, very clear and rather ingenious way of operating that was either temporarily or even quite long term, helping them, like a life raft or sort of scaffolding for their existence. And I met people. The series I made, I interviewed some contemporary people who'd experienced delusions, but they were it was difficult to cast that, because obviously people could only talk about them once they were no longer within them. And there was a lot of safeguarding issues to do with that. But we found some extraordinary people who were generous enough to talk about it. And, again, all of them said, I mean, some of them was very frightening, the way it came on. But generally speaking, they talked about it like a life raft, or like, they found the same metaphors, like scaffolding. And the idea that you just rip that down and go, that's not true, became more and more clear that wasn't the right approach. It was true. It was doing something, it was holding them up and telling you something really important about what they were dealing with, and what they were worried about, what their hopes and fears and possibilities and so on. And it wasn't about just dismantling that. Yeah.
Totally. Well, so it sort of leaves me with an idea for an exercise that people listening in, and that I'm sort of, as you're talking, kind of dipping a toe into, which is to get curious about your own beliefs, your own delusions, in the sort of delusion light sense.
Everyday delusions.
Yes, your own everyday delusions, and get curious about them and ask yourself, what function are they serving? And, why do you hold on to them even in the face of contradictory evidence? How might they be helping you, even if it's just to understand yourself better, or to communicate something important about yourself to the world around you, to people that are close to you, or to, maybe how are they helping to give you more of a sense of agency in a way that you feel really lacking in agency? To really ask that broad question about, like, how are your everyday delusions serving you, and in what ways? And I think getting curious about that can give you compassion for yourself, and maybe also give you compassion towards other people as well.
I really believe that's true. It certainly happened to me. And I was maybe more compassionate about myself, definitely. As I mentioned, nobody can kind of stand back from this topic. And if you know what enemy you're organizing, then maybe you can deal with your enemy, whether that's trauma, whatever it is that you can do therapeutically, or just to understand,
or your spouse,
or your spouse, or your spouse. Fill in the blanks. There's, but you can actually do something about it. But we're all organizing our enemy to just work out who the real enemy is, because we all want a job to do as well. That's the other thing about delusions; they kind of give you a job to do. We're all, I think, quite naturally studious, and we all kind of want to get on and sort stuff out somewhere and deep in us, don't we? Yeah. And having a delusion is a full-time job. You've got to really work hard to do that. It's not, it doesn't, it's complicated mental gymnastics, and you have to stick at it. And so if you can kind of put all of that industry and analysis and kind of doggedness in the right direction with slightly more self-knowledge, then, I think that could be really, really helpful. I won't go into my own journey too deeply, but yeah, no, I think it,
Oh, if we had time, I'd love to hear more about it. But one final thing that I'll say is that in the kind of therapy that I offer, acceptance and commitment therapy, one of the skills is to unhook from self-stories. And that's exactly what you're talking about, is to like unhook. This practice of getting curious about the delusions is a practice of unhooking from that story and asking yourself, is that whatever the function is that you're looking to serve, is that the best way, or is there another way that might even be more useful, right? That is not necessarily through that story, but in a more flexible way, oriented differently. And so I think this book and this idea that delusions are something to listen to be curious about, to have compassion towards, is really a very helpful stance to be taking, not just with your 5-year-old, not just with your partner, but with yourself.
Yeah, I'm glad you think so. I do think it is. I think, and you can see it on a global, not to go too far into that, but you can see with the internet, with misinformation, disinformation, being so easy now, and conspiracy theory being so widespread and so easily disseminated, having that voice in your head telling, unhooking from or just trying to think even if it's only about your own fixed false beliefs. I think that could have a knock-on effect in terms of how you relate to somebody in your family who, has fallen deep into a conspiracy theory. I think it could have big. It could kind of go from domestic into something quite powerful if a lot of us did that in our own, with our own fixed false beliefs. Yeah, kind of practice it.
Thank you so much, Victoria, for sharing your wisdom and your time with us. Where can people go to find out more about you and your work?
Oh, well, I have a website, victoriasheperd.org, and I'm doing various online talks. But yeah, I loved that conversation. Thank you so much. It's so interesting to hear your expertise kind of within the historical stories, how they sit in relation to your practice is fascinating for me. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. If you love to nerd out about books that offer wisdom on living well, join our Psychologist Off the Clock book club. We meet the second Thursday of each month at noon Eastern Standard Time in the U.S. In addition to the monthly book club meetings, you'll get a newsletter with tips, have the chance to meet some of our authors in person, and you'll get to vote on upcoming books that we'll discuss. To join, all you need to do is email us at offtheclockpsych@gmail.com with book club in the subject line, or you can link to us through the offers and events page at offtheclockpsych.com. We hope you join us for some book love and fun.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review or contributing on Patreon.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our newsletter, and you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Connect with us on social media and purchase swag from our merch store by going to our website at offtheclockpsych.com/merch.
We'd like to thank our strategic consultant, Michael Harold, our dissemination coordinator, Katie Rothfelder, and our editorial coordinator, Melissa Miller.
This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're having a mental health emergency, dial 911. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.